The only town in Britain to have a screaming Lord such affiliated Lord Mayor. The monster raving Lord Mayor. Actually, there's more county council, isn't it? Wasn't that fairly recent?
Everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. What about now if I do that?
No.
nod. Right. Okay. Well, I'm not a pop star, so I've never done this before. So, nor am I Lord Screaming Lord Such. who I've just heard that he's one of your illuminous brethren, or past brethren. So you must be conventional people then.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Well, introduction, man.
Oh, give me a chat. Yeah. I just want to say thanks to everyone for coming along. I thought there would be a bit more interest in this tonight because it's such a fascinating thing. But I see we have the cream of Ashburton's crop here to.
For the consolation of several people who told me they'd love to be here, but something else is on.
Well, so what I'm doing also, I'm recording it. I'm live streaming it, in fact, on Zoom and YouTube. So if you know anyone who wants to watch it, tell them to send an email to boxoffice@ashburtonarts.org.uk, and I'll send them the link, and they can join us on YouTube, and it'll be there later probably. As long as I can hear what Richard Julian's saying through the mic. What's that? Is that my ear, or is there a noise just started? Must be my tinnitus kicking in. No. Okay, no, that's all. Great. Well, thanks very much for coming indeed, and yeah, thanks to Julian for suggesting this. You told me someone else suggested this.
Yes, Karen, the lady over there.
Okay, right. And also there was someone else who lives in, or who owns the house that Richard used to live in, who was going to come, but
this lady's here who owns the house.
Snowed in.
Pardon?
She's snowed in.
Yeah, she's snowed in.
Yeah,
She sent me an email, so I've emailed her to tell her that she can look on YouTube. I don't have a phone number to call her.
Yeah, I'll let her
Pardon?
know. I'll let her know that she can.
Yeah, send her a text message or something, because I don't know if she'll check her email, but I've sent it, and she can join us. Anyway, we'll find out all about that. So Julian's talk's going to go for a while, and then we'll either just carry straight on into a discussion or have a quick break and get a drink if you need one, and let's see how it goes. All right, lovely. So Julian, David, thank you very much.
Yes, this is an unconventional town then, with two famous people, Screaming Lord Such, his friends, and Richard Carlile. Now, I don't know where to pitch this really. Maybe I need to introduce myself. My name's Julian Davey, and I'm working in the drama department at Exeter University. And I come to Richard Carlile in a roundabout way. I am not solely researching his life like you good people have done. So in the course of this talk, it would be really good if you have questions and discussion points to bring up. We can either do that during the talk or after, but I would like to pick your brains about Carlile as well as you listening to me. My background is looking at the period 1790 to 1831, because in that period there were three major hunger crises, even famines, in Britain, especially in the south of Britain. And not many people know about these families. They're not taught in school. 1795 to 1796, 1800 to 1801, and 1830 to 31, people died of hunger in Devon and further up to Sussex, into Surrey, and Oxfordshire, a little bit further up north than that, because of three things. One, poor harvests. Two, Napoleonic wars, French wars. And thirdly, and depending on your political point of view, the rise of capitalism, the market economy, that was good for some in a very good way because people began to store and monopolise their grain supplies. Farmers would wait for the prices to go sky high and sell it to the highest bidder. So that combination of three things meant people did really go hungry, destitute, and some people did die. And my research is looking into retrieving the stories of those people by looking at the drama of the time. because I should say that in the 1790s, 1800s, theatre was everywhere. It was an mostly urban phenomenon, but it was where people went every night. Just as we watched the telly, people would go to see a play. And in those plays, they would change over the course of a week. News would come in on the latest triumph of Nelson or whoever, and that would be put in a play, or maybe the lines would have been changed. So people got their news from that, and also it was a place of society where people would go to join in, look at the play, but also hobnob with each other, and there was often class conflict within the theatre. So it was a very auto-ethnographic sort of phenomena, the plays. So I've been looking at all the plays that were put on. When I say put on, I need to also explain there were only 2 theatres in London that were allowed to speak. Theatre Royal Drury Lane and Covent Garden were the only theatres in London that you could actually put on a play with words. Up to 1847, at late. Because they were the royal theatres, royal patents, only Shakespeare and all that sort of those 5-act plays could be put on there. Every other play was illegitimate and had to go through a censor and was usually forbidden. And so they would be put on in other theatres like the Old Vic, Coburg, Surrey, places like that, south of the river. But usually in pantomime, burlesque, burletta, music hall, even equestrian extravaganzas. Because then you could actually still put your meanings across, but without the words. It was a weird setup, and it had to stop, and it did stop by the 1840s. So my task is quite difficult, because I'm looking at plays that were put on only at Drury Lane and Covent Garden about famines that people couldn't care less about. If you think about it, it was an urban community. Even those people who were hungry were only a couple of generations away from the people sitting in the boxes on the pit. There wasn't an awful lot of interest, simply because the theatre managers, why would you want to put a play with people starving on it, on stage? Far better to show Nelson victory of the Nile in 1790. So my task is quite difficult. 1831, however, this man here actually decided, I'm going to go backwards, this is towards the end of his life, in 1831 he decided to set up his own theatre in London. He couldn't compete with Drury Lane, couldn't compete with Covent Garden, so he set up a theatre called the Rotunda, which I will tell you about a little later on. And on that stage, he put a play on about the swing riots. I don't know whether you know about the swing riots, but that was I'll tell you later. But it was a protest against people going hungry, and that's what piqued my interest from Exeter University, because I'm looking at the plays around famine, and this play on the swing riots was very much about the hunger crisis of the 1830s. And so I've gone back and back to through his life to see if he did anything else about famine. And what you all know, of course, so far is what a principled man Richard Carlile was. This isn't a hagiography of him. I'm not saying he was wonderful. In fact, he was. You could say he was quite obnoxious at times. But what I thought I'd do, because you probably know a lot about him already, I don't know how to. Do you know a lot about him already? No. Oh, right. Well, once upon a time, in a little street next to, well, quite around here, apparently this Richard Carlile was born. I'll go through a little bit about his brief. A little bit of his life then, just to. If you get bored with this, right, just give me a few hand claps and hand claps, and I'll move on. All right. So he was born in a place called Ashburton. Don't know whether you know that. Second of 3 children of Richard Carlile Sr. and Elizabeth Carlile, née Brookings. His father didn't hang around, but his mother took a shop in Lawrence Lane. Is that still here?
Yeah.
Well, there was a shop with her there. And she was a devout Anglican, and Richard and his brothers had a very devout upbringing. He went to 2 elementary schools in this town, but when he was 12, like they all did then, he had to find a trade, and he was apprenticed to a chemist in Exeter, Edward Lee. Came back to Ashburton to learn to be a tin maker, and he, for the next 15 years, was an itinerant tin worker, mostly making pots and pans, not only in Ashburton, but as far afield as Portsmouth and Gosport. When he was in Gosport, he married Jane Carlile, and they had 4 children, Richard, Alfred, Thomas Paine, who you may have heard of, but not that Thomas Paine, and another Thomas Paine, because one of the Thomas Paines died in childbirth. He felt after 15 years wandering around that he needed to exercise his growing radicalism, and he went to London, where there was, in that time, a complete fervour of radicalism. And it's worth just pointing at a few facts about London in the 1790s to 1820s. He was in the 1820s, but he would have joined in a radical milieu that was underground, but was very much influenced by Thomas Paine and his Rights of Man. And I should just fix it. That's where he. Sorry, I forgot to say that. That's perhaps where he lived in Ashburton. And this is Thomas Paine, who became sort of Richard's go-to radical. You may have heard of him, Age of Reason, those little books. When he was in the 1790s London, he was very much influenced by a man also called Thomas Spence. Thomas Spence, who was dead by the time he got there, set up a group called the Spenceans. And the Spenceans, or Thomas Spence, were very much involved in the campaign to nationalise land, which was quite a radical thing in those days. We all know what's happened about land grabbing since. We know on your lovely Dartmoor, people have recently walked to try and save a bit of that land for camping. Well, this was all part of the radical milieu in the 1790s. And so Spenceans would go to London taverns secretly, go upstairs with their bottles of port or porter, clay pipes, and discuss how to overthrow the government. If they weren't going to give people land back, let's try and overthrow them. And this was the sort of attitude that Carlile began to circulate in. So there we have The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine, which basically said every man has a right to a piece of land. No legal precedents should take away land. It was ours in the first place, and so that really attracted Carlile. Here's just one of many prints of the time that came. Many that came out at the time in 1819 when he was around. This was a fictitious pub, and you can see all sorts of radical emblems here. The guillotine, anti-monarchy, which we know Carlile was very much a Republican, I'll come on to, and poverty. And if you look carefully at the bottom, you'll see all the paraphernalia of church, bishop's mitre, crosses, all underfoot, because Carlile was very much against religion. Not a great advert for radicalism, really, if you think it's meant to be a panacea utopia. But there we are. That's the sort of the feelings that around radicalism in London when Carlile came. So Spence was important to him. Here is Thomas Spence, quite a ruffian from Newcastle, and set up a printing press and started radicalising a lot of the London underground. He brought out a pamphlet or two called the Pig's Meat pamphlets. You might have heard of Burke, Edmund Burke. He described the working class as pigs, swine. So in response, the Spenceans put out this pamphlet called Pig's Meat as a joke, and in it was very much radical stuff that Carlile would have read and read and read. Also, Spence produced tokens like money, and if you were a Spencean, you would have one of these tokens, and there's the pig. Of the tokens. Richard would have gone to some of these underground radical meetings where people following Spencean tradition would outdo each other in toasting. Here's a couple of them. May the skin of the tyrants be burnt into parchment and the rights of man written upon it. May the barren land of our country be manured with the blood of our tyrantry. That's quite radical stuff. If you were caught saying that or printing that, you would be in jail. This is the type of stuff that Carlile would have been speaking in those taverns. So really good for him. He was a brave bloke to be able to sit with his friends, depending on your point of view. I'm not sure it's very sort of kind, but at least it's quite shows what he was about. So, how did Richard Carlile get involved in his way in London? Well, he wasn't a good speaker. He knew that. There were other people who did the speaking for him, like Hunt, orator Hunt, people like that, and Cobbett. So he championed the press. He was very much in awe of the printing press, and he very soon became a printer himself. Here's one of the early examples of his work. It's called The Republican, and this particular letter was a letter to the Royal Prince Regent, who was praising what went on at the Peterloo massacre, which really got Richard Carlile's blood going. Have you heard of the Peterloo massacre?
Yeah.
There was a film a few years ago about it. It was a grand meeting in Manchester for the vote, basically, and annual parliaments and suffrage. And Carlile was there. Hunt was the main speaker, but Carlile was there. And we know that 15, 16 people were killed by the yeomanry and 500 people injured. And this got Carlile so angry that when he came back to London, he began to print The Republican to tell people what had happened. And he put out the news of what happened in another pamphlet newspaper called Sherwin's Weekly Political Register. Other publications followed suit. The Prompter was a big one, the Gracchus and the Gorgon. And then, going back to Thomas Paine, he printed two of Paine's works. One was called The Theological Works of Paine, which was banned in 1795, and he was prosecuted. It was his first prosecution for this. Everything Carlile did, every publication, it was heavily impeded by the state, because the state was so nervous at that time about the Napoleonic Wars, they were censoring everything. There were two gagging acts in 1795, which said you couldn't meet in public, you couldn't publish scurrilous material like Carlile was doing. And in 1794 there was a big state trial of 12 prominent radicals for treason, all of which who were acquitted. So that was the fervour of the time. It's important to know, though, if we look at his views, let's go into his views a little bit. That's Carlile in London from Ashburton. But what about his views? What did he believe in? Well, economically, it might come as a surprise to say that he actually was not at all socialist or communist. It's important to know that his radicalism was pre-industrial, pre-Marx. It was only when the Industrial Revolution took off that Marxism came in that you could say that you were a communist. He was very much, surprisingly, an individualist. He would have fitted in very well with the political neoliberalism of today. Because he felt that if you were in a part of a community, a socialist community, then you would become dependent on that community, and you would become quite soft and not individual, not standing up for yourself. Togetherness would stymie industrial inventiveness. It didn't stop him hating the rich, but he felt that in the emerging political economy, the capitalist economy was the way forward for people if they wanted to better themselves. He was, though, against heavy taxation. He said at one stage heavy taxes was preying on the very vitals of the poor and keeping millions of stomachs in a state of starvation. There was one tax acceptable to him, and it's just what it might be. Pardon? No, window tax was, yeah, it would have been window tax, but he didn't campaign for the window tax, it was the land tax. He wanted tax on land, which never came about. Window taxes did, and income taxes with Pitt. But he campaigned for a land tax, but no others. It's also important to recognise that even though he didn't really like communist ideas, he was for the producer against the non-producer. So people who owned land and sat there and accrued all the rents, he hated all of that. But he supported the people who actually did the producing, the rural labourers. In fact, at one stage he said, "I would violate every species of property." That's quite strong. I would violate every species of property. So, land, everything. Go and spoil it. And isn't that what we're doing today, some people? Trespassing and the trespass movement. Just beginning to find a voice again. And Carlile was saying the same sort of things all those years ago. He was not a political leader, nor was he a conscious spokesman for the working class. He just felt vehemently injustice needed to be fought against the rich, but that didn't make him a political leader. He never really solved the confusions of radical working class radicalism. And of course he hated the king, the monarchy. He said at one stage when he was speaking, "The Americans do not pour oil on the head of their president, and he makes a much more respectable king than any we have in Europe." He wanted annual parliaments, and he very much favoured a revolution. In fact, revolution was necessary. Just like in France, there needed to be a revolution here as well. And again, as I say, this was heavily influenced by what happened at the Peterloo massacre. Unfortunately, when he published the Paine's theological works, that was what got him in prison. He went to trial, and he bored the pants off everybody, because in the trial he read the whole of Thomas Paine's Age of Reason out loud. Very cleverly, because it was not allowed to be published. So by doing that, he published it, and apparently he sold 10,000 tuppenny penny copies after it from his own printing presses. So he knew what he was doing. But unfortunately, it landed in there, which you can still go and see, the very gates that Carlile had to go through. Can you imagine coming down from London in a horse and cart under guard, turning up in that for 6 years solitary confinement? But people knew it, and people raised funds for him, and he bought privileges when he was in Dorchester prison. He got writing material, he got better food, and this is perhaps beginnings of his sort of middle classness, he insisted on buying a cell away from the poor working class riffraff at the other end of the prison. And he was quite open about it. He took daily exercise, but he also took on a disciplined regime of good diet, vegetarianism, and lots of reading. And he continued his publications and his printing, his influence in printing from the prison. Here's an example of what sort of a letter, it's not a really interesting letter, to someone as he wrote from prison. It just talks about the business of a tract that he was writing. With thanks, I acknowledge the receipt of the volume entitled Fragment on Government, etc., which I have carefully perused. Also through the hands of my invaluable friend and preceptor, Mr. Place, and so it goes on. But this is the level of correspondence he was conducting in prison. So he couldn't have been too badly off. But 6 years was obviously quite a hardship. Let's leave him in jail for a moment, and let's talk about his shops. In London, he had 3 shops, print works and shops, and this one was number 62. He was pushed out of number 55, all on Fleet Street. That's where the printing is, as you know. And just looking at this, I mean, that's quite a brave thing to put out on your windowsills. You can see there's an archbishop. You see with the mitre on the left-hand side, with the devil behind him. And those sort of things were seditious. He would often have tricolours, the French flag, and laurel leaves, all the revolutionary symbols hanging outside his shop. So he was a brave man to be doing that. I'm not quite sure who the other man is on the right-hand side. I don't know. When he was in prison, other people had to run these shops, and they were called shopmen. People like Susanna Wright, Humphrey Boyle, William Haley, William Tunbridge, William Campion. And Ian McCalman in his work has reckoned that all the people who helped keep the shops going, the print works going, they took about 200 years of combined prison, being in prison about 200 years between them, just to keep Carlile work going. So there's a lot of dedication. He must have really been influential by them to be doing that. Here's an example. This is from the newspaper, 2 shopmen, their newspaper, 2 shopmen were arrested this afternoon by the Bridge Street gang. The same obnoxious pamphlets will be sold despite them. 'Tis a right and noble cause. They shall not, with all their combined powers, Shut up the temple of reason. O base gang, you will do no harm to the cause but good. This is the mart for sedition and blasphemy. Basically, the temple of reason was Carlyle's shop. We will keep it open. And what I like about this is they actually call their own work obnoxious. They're not trying to hold anything back. Their work is obnoxious, and their market is for sedition and blasphemy. Financially, however, the Carlyles did suffer. They would do. A lot of their stock was taken away by the authorities and impounded and burnt. And that cost an awful lot of money. And so, unfortunately, Jane, who was the person back in the shops, had to sell a lot of their stuff. Here's an example I found in a newspaper recently, selling off cheaply some of the tracts that Carlile had printed. And you probably can see some of them, the Quran, Pain at the top, of course, beautiful works. Palmer's Principles of Nature we'll come back to, Volney's Ruins, all extremely radical texts, Views of Insanity, and then a little bit about an engraving of the Manchester Massacre, Peterloo Massacre. So she was trying to sell everything she could to keep Richard and herself afloat. He was terrible to Jane, his wife actually. He really expected an awful lot of her. She was so exhausted all the time looking after the children. And at one time she actually took, on her visit from London to Dorchester to see him, took one of her very young children, Thomas, and she was so exhausted when she got to Dorchester prison. She just held out the baby in front of him and just gave the baby to Richard and just sat down in a heap. She couldn't even speak, apparently. She was so tired. He was very intolerant of her illnesses. Because she got so ill, he began to think that she was evading work. He said once in the Republic, his paper, when she was seriously ill, he said she should recover quickly, and any ground of excuse or evasion will be to me extremely painful. What do you think about that? So there is a bad, difficult side to Carlile. Anyway, after 2 years, Jane was prosecuted and his sister Mary Ann was prosecuted, and they too were put in Dorchester prison for 2 years when Carlile was there, and they shared a cell. What do you think Richard thought about that? He was furious because he wanted to carry on writing and he wanted peace and quiet. Apparently, Mary Ann, the sister, did sleep in a different cell at night, but during the day they all came back together again. Which is probably just as well she did sleep in another cell at night, because Jane gave birth to a baby in there called Hypatia from Richard. There will be more prison spells later. Right, let's have a quick look at his radicalism on religion now. I think you'd have to agree that he didn't really have a consistent view of his faith. He was born a devout Christian. He ended up as a philosophical Christian through a long period of deism and infidelism. Infidelism, or infidel, is a group of people who are atheists, basically. Infidels are atheists, but with a general belief of a need for a moral reordering of society. He would call himself an infidel, an atheist, but a need to do good in society. He was also called himself a deist, which is a belief in God, but that God created the earth, but that's it. No more intervention. after God had created the earth. No revelations in Gospels, nothing like that. The only way you could see God's work was through nature, science, education, rationalisation. These two things clashed. And he was heavily influenced by books such as this one. Everybody who was a radical, a Christian radical, a religious radical, looked at this book here by Volney, The Ruins, A Survey of Revolutions of Empire. It was a metaphor for the fall of man. It was a book sort of semi-religious or apocalyptic, zodiacal decline of Egyptian cities that would show the decline of man. And it was a very influential book. Other books Carlile would have read and be influenced by and poems was Shelley, who wrote a poem, a scurrilous poem called Queen Mab. I'm going to flick through some of these because we might be getting a little bit tired. Are you okay to... Not too bored yet? Oh, good. We've only got 2 more hours, that's all right. And this was also very influential. You saw this in Jane's List to be sold. Principles of Nature by Elihu Palmer. Again, it says development of the moral causes of happiness and misery among the human species. So all the radical religious people in those days had a real reason for their religion, was to create the salvation of man through reason. Not through God, but through reason. Still to perfect God, men, but through reason and knowledge and nature, love of nature. God was not important. In fact, he said at one stage, the mind that is untainted with religion has more scope and a better opportunity for improvement than any other. So without faith, without any non-material ideas, you could improve yourself. He was against, of course, the church. He was against priestcraft, as he called it. He was against the established Church of England, which he felt was corrupt, self-serving. And he was even against Methodists and Baptists, non-conformists, because they were too conservative. He supported the Spenceans Christian philanthropists, and he supported William Blake's demotic tradition. You've seen William Blake's paintings. He was an admirer of Blake. Now, I mentioned deism. Deism, as I said, was God created the universe but did not intervene. Well, his deism, Carlyle's deism, was a little bit different because he didn't accept it was the God who created it at all. He said, I believe in nothing supernatural. So somehow, and I don't understand this, he called himself a deist, but the essential bit about deism being God creating the earth in its first place, he didn't believe in either. But he did call himself a deist. So if anybody knows theology, I'd like to, which you can tell me after, how he squared that circle. He thought, and his people thought, that the earth, instead of God, was created by essences of chemicals, atoms essentially. Nothing else existed outside of matter. No life force. The system is nature only. So if you got rid of any encumbrance of non-material nonsense, as he called it, which stymied intellectual creativity, you had to replace it with something, and that would be education and knowledge. And it was that would bring you into morality through knowledge of science and nature. So there was a deism, he linked deism with the regenerative power of science. Superstition corrupts and deteriorates all the human passions, while science alone is qualified to amend and moralize them. Christianity is nothing but human misery, human torture, and humanicide quite strong for a Christian country, all of which would have put him in jail. But he did shift his religion as time went on. He was a deist. He then called himself a Christian atheist. And then in Sheffield, in October 1833, he declared himself a new Christian, which was he went back to the Gospels and said, actually, you can, with truth and reason, accept the Gospels were true. So he's shifting his position from nothing to do with God to actually saying, well, actually, the Gospels, you could equate that to rational thought. That put a lot of people's backs up. This is not what Carlile once said. He once said there was no God, and now he's saying that, well, the Gospels, you can actually justify the Gospels. And lots of people turned away from him, began to turn away from him at that point. He did have some weird ideas. He wrote to Queen Victoria asking her to set up a commission to interpret Scripture to transform mankind into a living temple, or worthy respectable of the Spirit of God, or of God as Spirit. And he wanted her to be crowned Queen of Israel. Despite such oddness, if you like, many people did acknowledge that Carlile was the person who converted them away from faith into free thought, free thinking. Here's an example of a gentleman who wrote in the Newgate Monthly magazine, I am an old Methodist of 40 years standing who arrived at the positive facts promulgated by Mr. Carlile and is now satisfied that all religion is a cheat and finds himself far happier as a materialist aged 60. Just one example, must have been thousands, of someone who actually would be converted by Carlyle's work. Carlile didn't stay in London. He also toured the north. He had a huge following in the northern cities, Liverpool, Nottingham, places like that. And he would go and do tours discussing all of his beliefs. And he was particularly popular with the artisan class, not the really poor, but the artisan, the shopkeepers, the petty bourgeois, the bootmakers, the craftsmen. Why would you think that particular group would be wanting to go and hear him, rather than the really poor?
Because they're really radicalised.
Perhaps, but not particularly. No, some of them were, yeah, but most of them weren't. Simply because, if you think about it, the Industrial Revolution was happening, and there was a bottleneck of all these old artisans with no jobs to go to, because of factories and machinery taking everything, and their lives were a misery. And so when Carlile came along and said, you don't have to live like this, it was that sort of class of people that wanted to hear his voice more than others. But you're probably right now, they were radicalised, weren't they, as well? Yes. So in all of these groups up north, he would do the toasting and the singing, and he supported the advancement of education. So you've got working men's groups sitting around reading the papers, looking at scientific texts, self-help, self-improvement. The famous groups he set up were called the Zetetic groups. These were a special group Zetetic is a Greek word for seeking after truth. And it was their reason to be, their raison d'etre was to learn the science. So these Zetetic groups were all over the place. There was one in Edinburgh Zetetic Free Thinkers Society, probably down here as well, and they raised a lot of funds. So the Zeticism was a way of getting his views across. Anyway, let's leave his politics and his religion, and let's talk about his sexual views. Now, this is quite controversial, and I don't really. It's perhaps an indelicate subject, so throw me off the stage if you want. Especially in prison, he turned his thoughts to his attitudes towards women, female equality, and female sexuality. Now, whatever you think of Carlile, his book on sex, this one, well, this is the newspaper version, it does deserve attention for its forward-looking libertarian approach to female sexuality. And if you're interested in that, I would recommend you to read the book. It's in print. For him, freedom of love, freedom to love, was an extension of freedom of thought. They went hand in hand. So no boundaries in what a woman or a man should be allowed or should not be allowed to do. It's free thinking. And so in May 1825, in his Republican, he printed this What is Love, containing most important instructions for the prudent regulation of the principle of love and the number of a family. As I said before, he was very much into individualism, political economy, self-help, neoliberalism, if you like. And so his views on sex was an extension of that. He basically said that he advocated the pleasures of sexual intercourse or commerce just as much as advocating market forces in the economy. You could sell, you could buy whatever you want in terms of sex. Okay. He said the more free the commerce, the more free each individual is to barter his or her love. So very much like a free love ethic, which is obviously the opposite of what Christianity was saying in those Victorian times. Now, female reformers, a lot of female reformers rejected Carlyle's work for its sensuality. It was too explicit. And certainly the working classes who read this stuff began to pull away from him as well because they thought it was too explicit. He said that, and this was unusual, that there was a biological foundation for equality in women in the sexual drive, because women and men had the same sexual drive, not men much more, but women were equal, simply because every man, every woman has the same equal desire to reproduce. And it's the desire to reproduce that creates equality of sexual interest and passion. He said in this book, a natural passion, or a passion in the body, which we hold in common with every other animal, the passion of love is nothing but the passion to secrete semen in a natural way. In those days, certainly Carlile thought that men and women secreted semen equally. Heavily influenced, again, by science, Carlile was very much into phrenology. Do you know phrenology? The examination of the skull. Some people can do it better than others. If you look carefully at the bottom of the skull on the right, the cerebellum, there are 2 or 3 allusions to love. Can you see in the right-hand side? A man and woman kissing and love. That is the bottom of the neck, that's the cerebellum. And Carlile thought that the bigger your cerebellum, the bigger your sex drive, which we know it isn't true. But it was the cerebellum that determined your sex drive. And so he wanted a law to be produced to prevent people with unequal sized cerebellum to marry. Which is, don't quite, well, there we are. That's what he wanted that. It didn't pass. And then contraception, again, economic reasons were uppermost in his mind, because contraception gave married couples the right to the freedom to limit their family size, and for single women whether or not to bear children. Now that's radical because it does suggest that you can have sex before marriage, which of course wasn't allowed in those days. This was, it was influenced by Mary Wollstonecraft in this. You might have heard of her. The Rights of Women, very influential. She's the mother of Mary Shelley, who, as you know, buried in Bournemouth, not too far from here. They were basically saying that, well, then this is not quite what we're comfortable with today. He said that for single women, contraception would empower them in the marriage market, because he wrote in the book that women who have never had sexual commerce, intercourse, begin to droop when about 25 years of age. But freed by contraception to engage in sexual intercourse, young women would then make an effort to enhance their physical appearance and not droop. This would put them in much greater demand by men, young men who would take them as wives, which would allow them to gain respect in society by being married. Now, that's an odd way of actually saying, but it's saying there is respect for the woman in that. If anything, if nothing else, it does attempt to dispel the myth of female sexual passivity and the social stigma of female sexual assertiveness. Not great on the device though. People call it sex manual, but it really isn't. Unless you want to put sponge inside yourselves or use a glove inside yourself. That's what's kind of recommended for contraception. And then, of course, came his relationship with this lady, Eliza Sharples. I told you he wasn't very nice to Jane, his long-suffering wife. Oh, no, sorry. This is part of the book. I claim equally for the female and give her the right to make advances in all the affairs of genuine love. I hate the hypocrisy, the cruelty that will stifle or disguise a virtuous passion, whether in the male or the female. He had an affair with this lady, Eliza Sharples. Eventually, Jane divorced Carlile because of him, because of her and him. Pardon? Do you? Yeah. And Eliza took on the role of printing his journals, far more than Jane did. She wrote her own journal as well. And when he was in prison in London, she visited him daily, and it was there for a short while somehow that she fell pregnant to Richard and had a son called Richard Sharples. Jane heard about this, was furious, wanted to divorce, left Fleet Street, number 62, and set up her own bookshop in Bright Street nearby, undercutting Richard's book-selling prices, which Richard heard about, was furious. And of his sons, he said to a friend, they have no view of a father, but he is a body to be fleeced. Anyway, Richard Sharples came along in 1832, but Carlile, fearful of his reputation, didn't want the news to come out about Eliza and him, and he started refusing to see Eliza at all, until the indiscretion did come out, and he began to write in his articles that their marriage was a moral marriage rather than a legal marriage, getting around that, and everybody laughed. He was scorned for his view that his marriage to Eliza was a moral marriage only. It really damaged him. We'll move on from, we'll talk a bit about pornography. Pornography was very much a part of the underground radical movement in those days. Here's a Cruikshank, actually, a cartoon, a man who is not very scurrilous, but this man has found out that his wife is got her engraving in the pornography book there. She's one of the 7 wives of the Sultan Sham. Sultan Sham has 7 wives, and his wife's in it. So it's rather scurrilous. Now, Carlile wasn't a friend of obscene literature, but he did support pornography on familiar libertarian grounds that if people wanted to, it wasn't obscene. It was wrong to classify sexual intercourse as obscene, as there was no legal definition of obscenity. Also, denying porn because it injured morality couldn't happen, because it was only the aristocratic people, the aristocracy, that could afford pornography, and they were already immoral and depraved. So, even in matters of sex, there was a class element in his views. How are we doing? Should we? Everybody okay?
Yeah.
Good. Not too far now. We must come on to this man here. Yeah, he was a nasty bit of work as well. Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor became friends with Richard Carlile, and they were a real force of radicalism in the 1820s and the 1830s. Taylor he complemented Carlile. They were a great partnership. Taylor was a showman, a spellbinding speaker, a wit, but temperamental and untrustworthy. Carlile was a poor speaker, but reliable and hard-working. Both were intellectual, but Taylor was dazzling. He was a surgeon. He studied theology at Cambridge and became a priest. He was a Reverend Robert Taylor. However, he quickly abandoned religion. He said, "What a downright fool I must be at 35 years of age to be at this baby's game still," Christianity, priesthood, "and still not to have seen through the trick by which fools and knaves of not half my natural ability have pushed me from my chance in the scramble of life." Basically, what an idiot he's been to be a Christian. His beliefs aligned with Richard, and he called Richard the God. And again, heavily influenced by the allegorical Vaughan's book. And they set up a debating society together, and they put these cards out all over the place in London. The Reverend Robert Taylor of Carey Street, Lincoln's Inn, and Mr. Richard Carlile of Fleet Street present their compliments as infidel missionaries to, as it may be, and most respectfully and earnestly invite discussion on the merits of the Christian religion, which they argumentatively challenge, in the confidence of their competence to prove that such a person as Jesus Christ, alleged to have been of Nazareth, never existed, and that the Christian religion has no such origin as has been pretended. Neither is it in any way beneficial to mankind, but that it is nothing more than an emanation from the ancient pagan religion. The researches of the Reverend Robert Taylor on the subject are embodied in his newly published work, the Digestes, in which may be found the routine of their argument, at home for conversation at any appointed time. Would you go there? It would be heavy work. Many vicars, many priests did go there to take part in arguments, which were very brave of them. Taylor got ahead of himself. He would go round giving talks, sermons, dressed up in red robes, with white kid gloves, flowing scarves and spectacles, and he called himself Robert the Devil. The Devil's Pulpit, Part 2, The Star of Bethlehem, a sermon preached by His Highness the Chaplain, the Reverend Robert Taylor, at the Rotunda, Blackfriars Road, November 21st, 1830. So he began to be the showman. Everywhere he went, he would have these red red robes on. And Carlile didn't really like it. But if he put the message across, Carlile was happy for Taylor to show off like that. He was, again, like Carlile, put on trial for blasphemy. All of this is blasphemy. He actually turned up in his trial with his robes on and shouting that Jesus Christ was a Jewish vampire. It didn't help his defence, really. And he was put in jail for 2 years. When he came out, they went on a tour together. So Carlile enjoyed his tours. They met all sorts of radical groups up north. South Cottian Israelites, Swedenborgians, Durians, Ranters, Wesleyites, Kilamites, Muglatonians, Old and New Israelites, Pedo-Baptists, don't ask, Baptists, particular Baptists, so it went on. All these different radical sects that they would engage with and ask vicars and priests to come to these meetings to have an argument with. And so a lot of brave priests did that. Just as they left for the northern tours, Taylor said, "We are going to unfurl the standard of infidelity. We are going to overthrow and destroy the Christian religion. We are going into battle." And just as they went off for their northern tour, Taylor went to Cambridge and pinned one of his tracts on the Cambridge chapel door. That's a significance if you know about Luther, who had done that Reformation stuff, 95 Theses in Worms 400 years earlier. Crowds came to see them. 500 people turned up each night in Liverpool. Especially because at that time, around the country, there was that millenarian feel, that chiliastic feel, that the world was coming to an end. And they preyed on that, using signs of the zodiac and all sorts of things like that, the mysticism, the semi-religiosity of it. Buoyed up, they were very pleased with themselves. They came back, and then finally, I think we'll stop soon, they set up together this, the rotunda. If you look, there's a stagecoach parked outside a portico. Do you see? Towards the end, about 3 or 4 doors in from the right. That was the rotunda. You can't see it, but at the back there was a huge, like this really, an amphitheatre which could take 2,000 people. And Carlile rented it out for £400 a year, which is a lot of money. And it was meant to be an arena, a theatre for radical dissent. And it was successful. It was the centre in London where all the radicals would find strength in numbers, safety in numbers, and go there to discuss matters of sedition. There were billiard rooms where Carlile would talk quietly. Next door would be Taylor talking about something else. Radical speakers like Galen Jones would come along. Coleridge spoke there. I wonder what Coleridge and Carlile talked to each other with. 2 Devon boys, of course. So it was a hotbed of sedition, and they couldn't be touched because it was south of the river. I bring that up because there were lectures and sermons by Robert the Devil, but then every other night a play was put on. So this one, when there was a lecture, the whole place was packed with 2,000 people, and Taylor would come on in his robes and he would say, "Satan, Beelzebub, Baal, king of the bottomless pit." And he came back from the stage with all this smoke, and a large globe came down from the ceiling, lit up with an image of the devil. The devil, he was the devil. It rotated to reveal a sun that reflected on the zodiac, signs of the zodiac on the ceiling. Can you imagine? All in the candlelight, the smoke. And then he was saying, I am the devil's chaplain, the Archbishop of Pandemonium, apostle to the Church of Rotunda. And he would pretend to get drunk on it and fall around before delivering one of his sermons, like raising the devil or a vindication of the character of Judas Iscariot. Carlile would wait in the wings, sort of, oh, God. And he called Taylor's work Holy Ejaculations. But then, and I'll stop soon, the other nights they would put on a play. And the play was called Swing, Who Are the Incendiaries? A Tragedy. As I said before, my work is about plays that were put on about famines. And in 1830 to 31, there was a serious famine in the south of England, people going hungry, and the swing riots came along. Briefly, the swing riots were groups of men who would go around smashing up threshing machines, smashing up barns, burning down farms, a bit like the Luddites in the north, but a southern agricultural version, to make sure that they would still have jobs. And they would leave a little note, not by Ned Ludd, but by Captain Swing, saying, if you carry on using your threshing machine, we will come and burn your house down. And they were called the Swing Riots. There wasn't a Captain Swing, he was fictitious. But Carlile and Taylor put on a play about swing, and this was it. And it was basically in support of the poor and the poverty-stricken people who were dying of hunger. In the play, for example, one of the characters says, the food you saw around ye, ricks of corn, barley and wheat, which your own sweat and toil had reared from the bosom of your mother earth, was none of it for you? You saw the rich man's dogs wallowing in fat, and your poor children starving. You were not so respectable in their eyes as a dog. This play also depicted the fall of the church and the monarchy. In fact, there was a young man who became the king. The church, the Archbishop's palace, was ablaze. And in melodrama, that's not meant to happen. Normally in melodrama in the Victorian times, there is a denouement, which basically said that, no, right will always win. Bad can never win. But in this play, it all went upside down. And you had, funny enough, the Archbishop of Canterbury claiming, turning tail and becoming a radical like Carlile and Taylor. There's all sorts of ups and downs. I won't bore you with the play bit. But anyway, it lasted for 6 nights. It was packed out, and lots of people enjoyed it. And then the authorities, in the end, did come and close the whole theatre down, unfortunately. So, we're coming to the end now of both their times, the radical times. The last years were particularly sad for both of them. When the Rotunda was shut, Taylor himself lost his way, became an alcoholic, always backstage drinking himself till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and eventually he just slipped away to Toulouse, where he died in 1844. And Carlile, well, again, he went through one more final Christian conversion, not to Christianity as we would think it, but he accepted the scriptures could be explained, all the scriptures could be explained by rational thought. And he went a little bit off the rails again, and he asked a new Jesus Christ to come and speak just at the Rotunda before it shut down, who was actually a man called John Zion Ward. But Carlile thought he was Jesus Christ. His last desperate publication, not the Republican, not the Prompter, was called The Christian Warrior, which you have to, if you read it, it does look rather gibberish, self-indulgent, and he began to see himself as a full-blown Jesus Christ. fated to carry the sins of the world until a crucifixion. He would be crucified. He said, "My spirit is on Mount Pisgah, seeing the promised land in the distance. I may not reach it, but I have seen it." So he was a fighter to the end. But by 1832, the Reform Act had come in. People were more interested in political reform through the ballot box than through his messianic religious zeal. Followers began to move away from him towards Henry Hunt and the Chartists later on. And eventually he was estranged from Eliza, who left him. She came back down here and then moved back to London and died in poverty. Jane died in poverty, both in London on their own. And Carlile died of bronchial infection in February 1843 in the shop, in one of his shops in Fleet Street. He dedicated his body to science. His brain was taken out, it was cut up. He was very pleased that that was going to happen. And there was a huge cortege at his funeral to Kensal Green, a cemetery in London. Snowing, the snow turned to rain, and as they were all standing round the grave, a priest came along and said, "Because this is a Christian cemetery, I need to do the service." And of course, his boys were there, and they said, "No, that's the last thing Carlile would want." And the priest insisted. So all the radicals went off whilst the priest did his sermon. And when the priest had walked away, they all came back and paid their own respects. He wrote his own epitaph a few years before, and I just want to finish with this. He wrote, I have since discovered, no, that's not it. He wrote, "I have extended the freedom of the press, promoted the freedom of discussion, excited public inquiry, dared the very jaws of despotism. I have lessened the conceits of kings and priests and lords. I have lessened their powers. I have given birth to mind, and if I die today, I shall leave the aggregate man better than I found him." Now, the great social historian E.P. Thompson argued that Carlyle's radicalism was the intellectual matrix for the Reform Act and all subsequent democratic protest. And if Thompson says that, if Thompson holds that view of Carlile, son of Ashburton, then that's good enough for me. Thank you very much. I've just read in that little green book that they couldn't find the grave. There it is. But he didn't want a gravestone. In fact, they couldn't afford one. But he's buried just in that anonymous little patch there. It took me ages to find it. But he's there, and that's just what typifies the bloke he was, really. He was a humble, well-meaning, very principled man, and you should be proud of him.
Thank you very much, Julian. Now, my hunch is that we should just crack on. Is that okay with everyone, or do you want a quick break to go to the loo or get a drink of anything?
Quick break.
Quick break? Vote for a quick break? Any more for a quick break?
I'm
Let's have a few minutes.
2 minutes. We'll keep it short. It's
because it's getting late.
just coming to 5 to 9. We'll be back just before, just at 9 o'clock at the absolute latest. But the bar's open if you want to grab a drink or the loose down the corridor. We shall.
I'll take a few questions after, and just maybe 15 minutes of discussion if you fancy that. Thanks a lot.
Well, once more, thank you again to Julian Davies.
Very confusing.
going to take very long. I was thinking about folk songs.
Oh yeah.
There's, of course, there's a lot of songs about hard times.
Yes. I mean, rural poverty at hard times. I just want to get underneath it into agriculture. If you ever think of anything, really interesting.
I can't think of anything specific about
Rural poverty.
yeah, Captain Swing would be good, wouldn't it?
There must be some Captain Swing.
I think.
1830s, it was not 1790s.
Yeah. Well, that was height of the 1830s. Broadside pictures.
If you can find it, so you nodding now, thank you. Yeah.
Were you in the country?
No, I was at the days ago taking back the
Allegedly. Yes, because I live
Okay, shall we have a wheel back?
Upper room with a large barrack house, the lower corner.
Yeah.
Yeah, except that he contradicts himself.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Just remembering.
Anyone with a burning question to ask Julian? So, actually, hands up, everyone who's got something they want to ask.
Oh,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, there's a few little things around. Okay, I'm going to take the chair's privilege of kicking it off. I've just got one tiny little one.
Yeah.
Actually, two tiny little ones, because one, there was, Mr. Place was mentioned. Do you know who he was or where he was from?
Francis Place.
Yeah.
He was a philosopher, a radical philosopher.
So part of the London crowd of
Yeah.
radicals.
Yes.
Okay, 'cause there's a Place Lane in Ashburton, and I just wondered if that was connected, but it sounds like not. My other one is in the list of books that it was there that his wife was selling. There was something, an exposition of Freemasonry. I take it he didn't like the Masons very much.
No, nothing organised like that. No, he didn't. But then I'm sure Jane put things in there of her own stuff.
Right.
And when she had got her own bookshop, she bought other stuff in. So maybe it was
So the
like that.
Freemasonry book wasn't one by him.
He did write a lot about the Freemasons.
Okay.
Did he?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, several tracts, and some of them fairly aggressive.
Ah, okay. Oh well,
Which wouldn't have endeared him to the
no.
judiciary and the police and politicians, probably.
Oh, thank you for that. I didn't know that. That's good.
Okay, so hands up again. There was one from Rick in the middle.
I'm interested in the swing. Do you know why it was called swing, and was it anything to do with swinging people's opinion from one side of society to the other, much like Peter Snow used to do with his swing or with I mean, it's an interesting word that they called their movement.
Yes, it was because people were hung, swinging from lampposts and swinging gibbets.
Okay, so it's satirical.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Gosh, that's really out there.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
But they knew that if they were caught, they would be hung or transported. And many were. 19 swing rioters were hung.
I'm amazed that Richard Carlile lasted as long, especially in the early days before he went to Dorchester. You would have thought in those days that, somebody from the palace or
Yeah.
would have just got hold of him and finished him off, and we would have never heard of him again because he was a troublemaker,
Yeah,
and
it was.
that often happened, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, they were persecuted in all sorts of small ways. If you were caught selling Carlile's newspapers on the street and they hadn't been stamped, you were put in jail for a whole month.
Well, especially at the time of Bonaparte, who was the absolute sworn enemy of.
Yeah.
So it was almost like working for the enemies.
Yes, that's
I'm
right.
amazed he survived.
It's true. Yes. Yeah.
Would you like to go back to say something about how repressive it actually was in that period?
Well, the two gagging acts, as they call them, 1795. If you went against them, then you were transported or imprisoned. The worst thing was the censorship of the play, the stage, I think. There was a man called John Larpin who was the chief examiner of plays. Him and his wife had to look at every play, as I said, and even small things. If you just said something like the House of Lords were a bunch of jokers, something like clowns or something, that was enough for your play to be cut. You know, these small sort of little things like that. It was very heavy-handed censorship. And then the 12 that were acquitted, the trial the year before, there was huge joy in London that they had been acquitted, because everybody really did feel that the government was overstepping the mark trying to bring them to trial, with like Thomas Holcroft and William Godwin. So there was quite a febrile, sort of suppressive atmosphere.
I was quite interested that they were acquitted.
Yeah, they were, because there was no real evidence. There was not a lot of evidence for what they had done, and people like Thomas Holcroft was a playwright. He was indicted as well as part of them, and all he had done was written in a few of his plays the criticisms of the regime, of King George III especially. So it's just those sort of small things. They were all gathered together, and Horn Tooke and people like that. They were good speakers, and they got let off, and they made a mockery of the judges who were trying to.
I was thinking, were they liberal judges?
No,
But
no, not at all. They were flummoxed. They didn't know how to cope with
I
them.
see.
In fact, one of the judges at Carlile's trial said, "What, are we going to take instruction from a tin man?" He said, "Oh, that's working roots."
Matt, that's
Just as he and his group were sort of taking the mick out of the establishment,
Yeah.
were the establishment taking the mick out of him? Are there cartoons of him and his crowd?
No. The cartoonists at the time were all people like Rowlandson, Cruikshank and Gilray. They were all pro-radicalism. You didn't get it until Gilray himself actually decided to do a deal with the government, and he got money to stop attacking the government. So the government didn't have their own band of cartoonists or anything to lampoon. No, they were just very severe, strict judiciary. No, there was nothing back. No. There were spies. They spied on them. There were lots of spies in these taverns in Bethnal Green. There was a big pub called the Crown and Anchor in the Strand, where all the radicals like Spence and Carlile, and there were lots of spies milling around, going upstairs with their gin and tonic, with their gin, not tonic, and spying. And you can if you go to the queue, you can see all the spy reports still. So, and it's very interesting to see. And these spies would perhaps become part of the Spencerian group for months on end before they were discovered. In fact, some of the spies were so well known the Carlile people would buy them a drink before they went upstairs to do their talking.
So, Inga at the back.
You said something about the Evidence Theatre south of the river because there couldn't be the same restrictions or something, and then they did end up closing it down.
Yes, because they weren't under the jurisdiction of the chief examiner of plays. That was just Drury Lane and Covent Garden. But the other, they called them illegitimate ones, they did have to comply with the magistrates, the local magistrates. So there were magistrates in the south of London who decided to close them down. It was just another arm of judiciary. They had to toe the line that way in the end. Yeah.
Lucy, did you want to?
No, it's okay.
No? Anyone else?
One thing struck me about saying you met up with other people like-minded in London.
Yeah.
Well, these days with the method of communication, that's relatively easy. How would they get together back in those days? How would we find people like-minded people?
It was a very small slice of London. These places, London in those days, it's not like London today. There was Shadwell, Spitalfields, Camden. There were hubs of reform, radicalism, seditious people around with their printing presses, and so it was all very close community, word of mouth. In fact, every theatre would have a printing press either on next door to it, and they would pack up and print things out and come to this meeting next week or whatever. They were very small worlds. They didn't mix in London.
It would be sort of, face to face.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody knew each other. All the radicals knew each other. In fact, it's interesting. He was an ultra radical, really seditious, but there were also radicals like William Cobbett, and Orator Hunt, and the Godwin Enlightenment set, Mary Wollstonecraft, and they didn't even mix either. They went to their own different theatres and stuff.
How did you become so interested in Richard Carlile? How does this work relate to what you're doing at the university? I mean, this enthusiasm and passion you seem to have for him and his life.
That's a great question, thank you. Well, because I researched the swing play, first of all, because I was interested in the land reform, which the swing play chimes with my, I'm sorry to be political, my abhorrence of land grabbing. That there is, especially on Dartmoor, and those two things came together. The fact that people in the swing riots were dispossessed of their land, thrown out of their cottages. It was a time of enclosures, land enclosures with fencing put around common land. And I felt that this play resonated with me because of my own personal beliefs about I feel that land was stolen in the first place, really. So that's how it mixed up. And this is the only true revolutionary play that was put on from the 1790s to 1830s. I can't think of any other play that would. Didn't have time to go through it, but it does talk about getting rid of the monarchy, getting rid of the church, the judiciary. It's like an anarchist play, and nothing had been seen like that before. It was so popular, and that really piqued my interest. The fact that something so radical could be put on in those times, despite being, you would easily be transported or killed or executed.
Where can we get hold of the play to read it?
Would you be interested in reading it?
I would, yes.
Okay, can you give me your email address or something?
Yes.
I can give you some.
Okay, yes.
I can get it to you.
Thank you.
I can get it to you electronically.
Yes. Okay.
There was an archbishop in it called the Archbishop of Kent. I say no more. And Judge Jeffreys.
In Ashburton, he's thought of as the instigator, as it were, of freedom of the press.
Yeah. Well, he did so many publications, short-lived ones. Some only lasted 3 or 4 weeks. The last one, Christian Warrior, lasted 4 weeks. Others, the Prompter and the Republican, were longer. Yeah, he did. He put his faith in the press because he knew he wasn't a speaker. He wasn't a good writer, actually. If you read his stuff, you wouldn't say he's a good writer either. But yeah, he was a champion of the free press. It was his God. He said one stage, the press is my Mecca, my God. The printing press.
Do you know if you spent any time in Ashburton?
Never came back.
He never came back after that.
It's like Ottery St Mary. They try and claim Coleridge as their own, but they were both left about 12 years of age, and Coleridge never came back. And he didn't.
But Liza,
I don't know where she didn't come back here.
His mum stayed.
She's Devon.
His mum stayed, didn't she?
You tell me. I don't know the history of that.
I think she had a shop and sold pop.
His mum did. Yeah, his mum had a shop.
Yeah, I think
Wendy
yes.
thinks it's haberdashers, doesn't it?
Yeah, haberdashers, yeah.
Really? Okay.
Just at the top of St Lawrence Lane.
Right.
I'm not sure which side, but it was at the top of St Lawrence Lane.
And do you know where his dad got to? Because I just know he deserted.
He just deserted the family and went his own way, didn't he?
Yeah, that's all I know.
Yes.
I wonder if you knew where he
No,
went to.
I didn't follow
tell you that in about 1800, 1801, Coleridge and Wordsworth were in the Quantock Hills, just north of Taunton, and they were in a rented farmhouse with a couple of girlfriends, and the locals were very suspicious, and somebody wrote to London saying, we think there's French spies in the Quantocks, and a man came down from London to see what was going on. They were in their early 20s. And he said, no, it's just a couple of poets and their girlfriends, staying up late.
That just shows the febrile that just shows the sensitivity of the time, doesn't it?
Because of the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But all that repression continued long after the war, didn't it? There was a huge resistance to any liberalisation.
Censorship in the 50s.
But the thing is, the movement for reform died out really. For real radical reform that Carlile wanted, it was by the 1820s. His group were dwindling because it was the constitutional reform that was gaining in popularity to get the vote, annual parliaments, equal suffrage. That was far more visible. So there would be lots of processions through London with people who were wearing caps of liberty and laurels in their lapels. It was a visual sort of popular reformist movement, which was Peterloo was a similar sort of thing, and that was the sort of reform movement that took over the radicalism of Carlile, and that's why we were so disappointed in the end. And then Reform Act came along, Chartism came along, and it was all about constitution and political reform.
Do you think he stayed sane?
No, I don't think so. Well, not in the end, when he thought he might have had a crucifixion coming his way. But maybe it was just delusional sometimes. But he was so principled. He did everything he could to debate all the tricky topics of the day. He didn't stop.
Well, on that note, I think we'll stop. However, Chris, I think, wants to say something. Before he does, just once more, appreciation for Julian. So, Chris, take the mic and the floor is yours.
Well, I'm sure I can make myself heard from you.
They probably can, but if you do that, then we can see it later if we want.
Well, I'm very grateful to Julian for an enlightening talk and for bringing Carlile to everybody's attention, because I personally feel that he's a character who ought to be much better known on a national stage, and certainly ought to be much better known in Ashburton, because quite a number of people heard about this talk and said, who's Carlile? Even somebody who works in the museum never heard of him. He hasn't been around very much. But really it was a terribly repressive time when he was living in it, and he was a man of principle. Now, he was clearly ill-educated, and his education such that he got was self-taught, and he suffered all the disadvantages that people of that sort suffer. So that probably explains a lot of his inconsistencies, but he's an important figure, I think, because he's such a man of principle. He was prepared to spend 9 years in jail, 9 years in total, over a period, simply for speaking his mind. And you might not agree with what he said, and some of what he said was eccentric and inconsistent, but nevertheless, I think he deserves a huge encomium from us for standing up for the rights and against what was a completely intolerant and repressive government at the time, and we all owe him a huge debt of gratitude. And I think he ought to be much better known nationally. He ought to be much better known in Ashburton, which is his hometown, which is why I've passed around this bit of paper, hoping I can get some support for some sort of memorial in the town, so that people will remember him in the future. And I'm grateful to Wendy Major, who's produced this little booklet, which is available in the St. Lawrence Chapel. Because Wendy's done a lot of research about Carlile and had all sorts of interesting correspondence, which is available for you to see in St. Lawrence Chapel. But she's particularly recorded in here that Carlile wrote to Eliza, who heard about it in Julian's talk, about his birth. And he says, in 1790 I first drew breath at 3 in the morning in the 8th of December in an upper room of a large barrack-like house at the lower corner of Stevehead Lane. It must be a misprint for Heavyhead Lane, which is now Woodland Road. He said, the manger of Bethlehem was not more humble. So we've rather picked on that, and we've had a careful look at Woodland Road. The only house that really fits the bill is number 17, which is certainly a large barrack-like house. Wendy tells me that she knows somebody who used to live there right at the turn of the last century. She doesn't go back that far herself. But it was always in multiple occupation in those days, and the thought of being born in one room in that house and spending your early years in there is quite astonishing. Carlile made as much of himself as he did, really. But we've identified that house. There is some question of whether it might be some alternative. Alan thinks he knows possible alternatives, so we need to check on that as we can. But our current idea is that we should look for some sort of plaque to be placed outside the house to draw people's attention to it and record the fact that Carlile lived there and was born there. There may be some other schemes if we can get something on foot. That would be fairly easy to do. So I'm grateful for those of you who signed the bit of paper that's gone round, so we know who we can look for, practically for some support in the future, and hopefully if something comes up fairly quickly, we will be able to email you and let you know what's going on. So I'm very grateful for that. If anybody hasn't signed it or would like to sign it, I've taken the liberty of calling it the Friends of Richard Carlile. Some of you may remember that poor chap John McCarthy was imprisoned as a hostage in Beirut. He had 5 years of this, and it was a very successful campaigning organisation for him called the Friends of John McCarthy. I've got to borrow the name from that. But if you feel you might like to be a friend of Carlile, however difficult and stubborn and awkward like he must have been, then I'm grateful if you could give us your support. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you, Chris. Thanks again, Julian. Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. See you tomorrow night if you want to come and socialise with Creative Types, the new artist group running it, but they want anyone involved in the arts of any kind, or who would like to be, or who would like to hang out with them, is welcome tomorrow night in here. And then we have the Ploughing the Salt Sea by Billie Harling on Saturday. And I have it on good authority that she is amazing. This is from a friend of a friend who's a theatre and production designer who's just seen her and thinks that she's really fantastic. She's doing this Ploughing the Salt Sea, which is, she's a singer and musician, but she's telling, it's a theatrical story about women's history or women's stories from fishing towns, I think. That's all I know about it. I mean, she's from Hastings and she traced it back, tales from the wash house and things like that. But it sounds like it's going to be quite a production on Saturday evening. In the morning from 11 till 12:30 she's running a little workshop which has money from the Arts Council, so it's free to come to, where she is inviting people to tell stories of their own women in their families and telling them, write them down, draw something. I don't know exactly, but she's again, she sounds like she's an interesting person who would be good to spend an hour and a half with on Saturday morning, looking into all of that sort of stuff, telling the stories from women's history that often are not recorded or written down or remembered so well. So that's what it's all about. So that's on Saturday. Do come again. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks very much. Cheers, Joanne. I'll see you. Hi, Luke.
I'll check. That certainly fits the description. Yes, but I think this is typical local history, which is
this is Luke who,
wishful thinking.
This is Luke Shepherd who I think
But no, I'll come on something else. In everything you do, don't you? Put on
People signed up.
There's a band playing
We need to get together and have this. Thanks for opening
But some